Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Gregory, and this is Accounting 616, Financial Research and Compliance, and we are in week 7. This week, we're going to be doing some discussion on how to research tax issues. Now, I will tell you that I am not a tax expert. I don't do taxes. I didn't do taxes during my career. My career was focused more on fraud and auditing. So I don't have a lot of background in this, but what I want to say is tax research is no different really than any other area of accounting to research. So we want to look at these again, obviously from the tax perspective. So we want to, again, just as we do with any other engagement, really understand what our clients' needs and issues are. Some of that may be maximizing shareholder wealth or maximizing their own personal wealth in the business. It could be to look at some tax planning opportunities that we might want to invest in the future, such as looking at succession planning. We could be looking at inheritance or estate tax planning along with the tax perspective. We may be just looking at how we can help the client reduce taxes within their company. We also need to know how the records are maintained. I can tell you from talking to colleagues of mine in the tax world that oftentimes they're presented with a box of stuff. And they may have to do a lot of work to prepare for a tax return because they've got to sort through it. When we are working with our tax professionals, what I will often do, because we have, my spouse and I have our businesses plus our personal incomes, is that we create spreadsheets for everything. And then we will often support those spreadsheets with copies of documentation. We also want to look at, if it's a business, what the inventory is. How is the inventory valued? That could be a really good tax planning strategy you could work with them on in order to perhaps give them some different positions on how to value and report their inventory, maybe look at depreciation choices that they've made. And then what are these tax implications regarding financial decisions? There are times when, if you use certain inventory methods in your financial records, you must also use that same approach in your tax preparation. So are we looking at maybe making some changes in our accounting principles or our measurements? Maybe we're looking at some capital gains and losses. We may want to look at deferring our capital gains as long as possible. Maybe we want to absorb some losses now in order to reduce our tax burden. And remember, tax research always goes, you can do tax research for personal as well as for corporate tax issues. And sometimes if you're working with a sole proprietor or an LLC of one person, you have to simultaneously be researching both, because the effects of the corporate tax issue or the sole proprietor or the partnership tax issue can also affect the personal taxes of that individual. Some things to think about, especially if you are working in cross-border jurisdictions. Perhaps you are a CPA in Washington State doing tax preparation, and you have clients that live perhaps down by the border, but they work in Oregon, or you are handling someone else's taxes from another state. You have to understand that there's going to be local, county, state, and federal tax laws, which may be different in these different jurisdictions. For example, in Idaho, you have a state income tax. Well, in Washington, you don't. But if you are doing someone's taxes from Idaho, you have to be cognizant and aware that there are state taxes that have to be considered along with the federal taxes for that individual or for that business. So you have to have a really good understanding. Most of the time, if you're going to practice in another state, you will have to have some state CPE for that state's particular taxes in order to be able to practice in that state. We have to think about some purchasing methods and purchasing out of state or out of the country. What tax implications do we have? Maybe we have some tariff rules we have to think about, or we have some foreign currency changes that we have to account for that can affect taxes. This comes right on the heels of the next point, cross-border global tax issues. So we have to think about not only local, county, state, parish, federal, we may have international tax laws we have to account for. And research involves reviewing all of the laws and statutes and facts. So you're going to be going beyond just looking at the irs.gov site. You're going to have to go to tax statutes. You're going to have to go to revenue rulings and other types of maybe some tax court issues, because those apply to specific tax situations and not necessarily what we call the society at large. IRS.gov can go with the society at large, but you may have to go with other tax filings and tax court proceedings because there may be specific or unique issues that are not going to be covered in that level of depth with the IRS.gov site. Couple things. I hear this a lot from students, and it's just because sometimes we get the words switched up. Tax avoidance and tax evasion are two different words. Avoiding taxes is legal. We could get through loopholes that are in the tax code. We could look at the qualified deductions. We could look at safe harbor rules. There are plenty of rules that we can do to avoid paying more taxes than we have to, and it's legal. Tax evasion is illegal, and that's avoiding to report income or reporting more expenses than you really have in order to deceive the government and reduce your tax burden. But when you have evasion and avoidance coming together, where we're taking lawful methods to lower our taxes, that's a good thing. We don't want to try to lower our taxes through falsifying or illegal activities. Now, in all cases of tax research, always follow the professional standards. Circular 230, the AICPA standards, and the IRS agreements on tax preparers gives us our professional standards for tax services. So just like a CPA or a CFE or a CIA, we also have standards and codes of conduct as tax preparers. So we can do research on tax compliance, how we prepare our tax returns, what financial statement notes and disclosures we would have to give that talk about taxes in our financial records. We can look at tax litigation, the prosecution or the defending of a taxpayer position in the court in front of the IRS based on audits or investigations. And we can also help our clients with tax planning. And that's a lot of what clients come to us as tax preparers to do, is to help us strategize and develop ways or methods to legally minimize the tax burden, working with the states, working with trusts, both business and personal taxpayer goals. Just like any other research, we need to know what the facts are. What are we trying to accomplish? If a client comes to you and says, my taxes are too high, I want to reduce them, that's a good start. So you need to find out what the problem is. Why do they believe that they're paying too many taxes? And it may be looking at their financial records and saying, well, it's because you're doing straight line depreciation, and maybe we can do an accelerated depreciation and be able to legally reduce your tax burden. Again, you have to understand tax laws. And that's one of the big things with taxes. It's constantly changing. You really need to stay up on top of it. It's not simply going onto a software program and plugging information in. There are lots of tax databases that we can use, that CCH, Bloomberg, BNA, Thomson Reuters. And in some of these, there may be a fee involved to access some database information, but you may want to get subscriptions to these because they will help you as you research sometimes very complicated tax cases. Lots of authorities, lots of areas to go to, IRS codes, the US Constitution, tax treaties. These are very important if we are doing international taxes. If you have people living in one country, doing business in another country, there may be international tax treaties going on. Treasury regulations, revenue rulings, revenue procedures, US tax court cases. Those will give you a plethora of information. You know, the Journal of Accountancy, I get the Journal of Accountancy every month as a member of the AICPA. And one of the things they do is that they highlight tax, interesting or relevant tax cases on when people can use deductions, when they have used deductions and the tax court has ruled not in their favor. So you can sometimes get some really interesting tax cases through the Journal of Accountancy as well. Research process is the same. You got to know what the facts and the issues are. Then you got to collect the data from the appropriate authorities. Again, the IRS.gov is not going to give you the answer to everything. You will have to research outside of that. Analyze your research. Make sure your research is not biased or slanted. Don't go in there saying, I just need to have some confirming research that says we can do X, Y, and Z. Go out there with the open, unbiased mind, develop your reasoning and conclusion, and then communicate the results to your client. The big challenge we see is tax laws is constantly evolving and changing. We don't have huge changes. The last huge change we had was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So the government doesn't come by and make sweeping changes to tax code, but they do make changes to tax code as sometimes different types of deductions or exemptions sunset and sunrise in the legislation. So you may be able to have, say, used a deduction of an energy credit one year, and maybe that energy credit legislation has sunsetted and you can no longer do it. So you will have to keep up and say, well, if something is sunsetting, is the taxing authority going to go in? And sometimes that taxing authority comes pretty late in the game. So even if you're doing someone's taxes, you also need to stay abreast, or if you're doing the research on taxes, stay abreast to these ever-changing issues that are going on. Now, the CPA exam, if you have not yet taken it, will test skills using code and treasury regulations. It's usually through simulation. They may have you do a test case, or they may have you complete a tax form. I remember when I was doing my CPA exam, they had us do a K-1 partnership return. And so we had to know enough about K-1 partnership returns in order to take the data that they gave us and simulate a tax return. One thing I would say is, if you are interested in taking the CPA exam, do read up on the CPA evolution, because there are changes coming down the pipeline regarding the exam in your class resources, and that will give you some guidance as to whether or not you should be taking the exam now or if you wish to wait later on. Tax analytics or data analytics and tax research. Big, big, big. Sometimes you are going to be looking at volumes and volumes of data. PricewaterhouseCoopers has a tax analytics that they prescribe. You can use different types of software. Tableau software is very popular in this. I am not well versed in Tableau software as I do not do data analytics at this point in time in my career. But we can develop reports, we can develop visualizations, graphs, charts. We could do some predictive analytics and planning where we can do if-then scenarios or what-if scenarios and play things out. For example, if you want to reduce your tax burden by 20%, maybe what we want to do is do some changes in our revenues and expenditure side in order to see if we can meet that 20% reduction. So you'll be doing a lot of scenario testing. We do some strategic options out there. By providing that scenario testing, we can go out and make recommendations as to what we might want to do in order to reduce our tax burden. And we can do advanced decision science, which is a very much higher level of data analytics. Our deliverables this week are our 2 discussions and active participation throughout the week in the responses. Be sure that when you are doing your discussions, just something I want to add, make sure you are lifting off of the initial post from your classmate. Identify something within their post and then add to it, expand upon it, using additional sources. This week we have a tax issues case study that we'll be researching, and we have our GLIME simulation for topic 7 at theglime.com. And be sure to read all the other required readings that are provided to you. Now, you're going to review a case study provided on Allison at the Canyon Law offices on a tax issue. After you read the information, and I believe it has to do with Allison's request for deductions on meals and entertainment expenses. So, keyword, meals and entertainment expense. Go out and start researching what we know about that through the different resources. You're going to provide an introduction and a review of the issues that Allison has presented to you. You must use 2 authoritative tax sources, and one of them may not be your textbook. So you can use irs.gov and another source. You can use revenue rulings, treasury rulings, and at least one tax case that involved meals and entertainment expenses. Provide a conclusion as to the amount and your rationale of what is eligible that Allison can deduct based on the spending of $45,000 she did last year. Here are some suggested headers. Introduction and overview of Allison's issue, tax regulations on meals and entertainment expenses, the amount of allowable deduction of that $45,000 could be part, it could be all, depending on your research. What is your conclusion? And be sure to include a separate page for references. I think I brought this up last week, but think ahead. In week 8, you have a final project, which is the culmination of weeks 1 and 3 and the additional work to do on week 8. So review the feedback I gave you in weeks 1 and 3. If you don't understand something, please reach out and set up an appointment with me and we can go over that. Also, look at the requirements in week 8 and be prepared for this. This is a fairly large project and it's going to take you more than a couple of days to do it. So make sure that you set enough time aside for you to thoroughly review and be prepared for this. If you have questions, please post them to the classroom for the good of the class. You can reach out to me through a Halo message, or you can schedule a Zoom call through Calendly with me. Go Lopes. Have a great week, and I will see you in the classroom.